pressure the states to legislate. So we'll see. It should be.
So after I attended Scott's presentation this summer, we had a discussion about, is there no response we can make to this? And I think what Scott has demonstrated is, well, you're not going to stop climate change. It is here. It is going to happen. But that doesn't mean that there's nothing that we can do. But I will preface my comments by saying, if you think I'm going to give you the answer, you're going to be disappointed. Okay? I'm only going to tell you about some reading that I've done since Scott's presentation this summer, some ideas I can put together, and sort of pointing in the direction of a response that I think we can make. I will also tell you that as I've read more about this, as time has gone on, I have found out that there are many other people looking at from the same point of view that I have. I'm going to change a little something here and make this make more sense to me. Just a second. Sorry, I should have taken care of this before, and now I'm mystified by it, so I have to get out of this. Okay. I'm sorry, something's happened here that I hadn't expected.
Yeah, go over the bridge, yeah. So, it's very large landform.
Let's talk about the dishwasher report. Jim last Sunday or something. My comment probably
Where I want to be. Okay. So, as I say, this came out of a little bit of discussion we had after Scott's presentation, and then more reading that I did this summer related to how people are responding to this, possibly in other ways that don't have to do directly with how you address the challenges of climate change, but more how we might address it by other means. First, just to kind of continue the bad news here, welcome to the 21st century, okay? A lot of social science is going on right now that deals with the fact that we are not a rational species. You may have heard of behavioral economics, where we show that people who are planning their investments, given the odds to make a gain, which also involves the risk of a loss, will not will not risk the gain if the odds are equal with having a loss. They will avoid the loss more than they will try to obtain the gain. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And everyone's scared of losing money, but they're scared of that to the point where even a reasonable risk to make a gain, they won't make. That's one example of how we are not rational. Also, you can tell people a story, okay? You tell them a story about two people, and you know, one of them's a good guy and one of them's a bad guy. And you ask them, which of these people would you like to have living next door to you? And of course, they tell you the good guy. Then you tell them, this is all a hoax. This is all a lie. We made up these stories. They aren't true. Which person would you vote for now? They don't say, it doesn't make any difference. They still vote for the person that they voted for before. Okay? So we're not especially rational as a species. I could show you examples of how field mice, white-footed mice, are much more rational than we are at handling very complicated algorithms about how they judge how far they go for food, what the risks are in that food source, its nutritional value, and they're working this algorithm all the time, much more dynamically than we can. All right, one of the other things that's come up is the agricultural revolution, the Neolithic Revolution, was probably a mistake in terms of the world that we live in and our ability to sustain it. We got a less nutritional diet. By domesticating animals, we got closer to a lot of animal pathogens that have crossed over to us that wouldn't have otherwise. It takes more labor to do agricultural work than it does to do hunting and gathering. The people who are in hunter-gatherer societies spend less time gaining their nutrients every day than people in agriculture do. Because of this, we have tended to overextend population in agriculture to get more people to work in the fields. So that this has led to several of society's worst problems. Slavery, warfare, have all, in a way, been driven by the agricultural revolution. There's more and more science over the last 20 years through DNA samples and other things that are showing these factors about the direction we have taken. There's, of course, a much greater ecological burden by developing monoculture instead of having intergrown species that sort out their own level of presence in the environment. And finally, when you do agriculture, sooner or later you have to have some sort of hierarchical planning for the agricultural endeavor. And this leads you to having hierarchies and elite groups who benefit at the expense of the larger, lower group on the hierarchy. Okay. Next, of course, we have learned that democracy is increasingly corruptible. 20 years ago, 30 years ago, at the dawn of the digital age, people thought we now have the means for absolute democracy. People will be able to be informed, and they will be able to vote directly on issues. There will no longer be as much need for representational government. But of course, what have we gotten instead? Misinformation, emotional arguments. Emotional arguments, any marketeer can tell you, are much more durable than rational arguments. Confirmation bias, we only talk to the people who agree with us, and we seek out information that confirms our biases rather than seeking information that challenges our thoughts. And of course, there's a general loss of confidence in the democratic process. This diagram you've probably seen before in some form. The pie is the voter eligible population in the 2016 election. Approximately 26% of the people voted for Donald Trump. approximately 27 to 28% of the people voted for Hillary Clinton, and almost 50% did not vote. The decision to select the president, the highest office in the United States, was on the basis of what 26% of the population thought. Does that apply to us? On November 7th of this year, 2 days ago, we voted on Act 46. 15% of the population decided whether we were going to have Act 46 or not. That's the total voting population, not the part that voted for it or against it. So about 10% of the people supported Act 46, and it still lost. Okay. So what I'm saying is that this is right here and right now. It's a small election, no major office. But what could be more important to a community than how its school system operates? No matter how you feel about it, wouldn't you go out and vote? Okay, and finally, we are addressing over the past decade or so the socially corrosive effects of economic inequality. Eugene Pecchetti's book in 2009, Capitalism in the 21st Century, he laid out from 700 years of market evidence a case that capital always returns a greater return on investment than the general growth rate of the economy. Labor, therefore, gets you less return on investment than capital does. This means that unless something is done by some other means than the market to correct income inequality, it will never correct itself. Now, he also points out, and I've written some of the myths here, that's the first one, the markets will correct themselves. By his evidence, there's controversy about it, but by his evidence, that is not true. There's also the idea that rich people spending their money will benefit the economy and rich corporations. Right now in this country, there are corporations sitting on bags of money, and the R&D rate by corporation is the lowest it's ever been, or at least post-war in the United States. Okay, it's great. It's a perfectly valid business approach to go and buy up companies that do other R&D. That's fine if you're developing a smartphone app. But if you want to do basic research, let's say in particle physics, you don't find many little startup companies that are capable of doing that. So at some level, if government isn't involved, or if major corporations are not involved, fundamental research doesn't get done. And finally, that a certain level of wealth inequality is good because it's inspirational to those who will seek to improve themselves and become wealthy. Well, we'll talk about that a lot more, but in fact, there's more and more science saying no, wealth inequality is a very serious problem for any community or culture or society that wants to maintain itself, that wants to be sustainable. So, and besides that, climate change is here. So many of the tools we think of as being the tools that we might use to address climate change really are suspect in the 21st century. So let me ask for 3 people to tell me, 3 people in the audience, what information source do you rely on and trust? Anybody?
NPR.
Julie, NPR, okay. Someone else?
Washington Post.
Hmm?
Washington Post.
Washington Post, okay.
Weekly.
I'm sorry.
The guardian.
The guardian, okay. So within this room, you have sources, and let me ask one more part of that. How much do you rely on that individual source? That's not a question you really have to answer, but I'm asking that because, in fact, it does bear on the earlier question that we had about confirmation bias or the other information. Are you staying with information sources that confirm your way of thinking? Okay, so what's a resilient culture? Suppose we wanted to build a resilient culture. Culture in general, we think of as values. You know, what values do we hold? Is it all right to steal? Or should you always tell the truth? Those kinds of things are what we talk about as values. There are customs which we think of as sort of the historical, sort of our heritage, you know, the rituals or the manners of dress or things like that sort of define us. And finally, we have norms, which are how anybody would expect you to behave in any given situation. If you see smoke coming from a building, what should you do? There's norms within society for how you would do that. If you meet a panhandler on the street, what's within the normal custom within the group you live in as to how you'd respond to that? So that's the culture. But there's a very interesting, I don't know if any of you have seen or read this book, Tribe by Sebastian Junger. He talks about the things that a culture has to provide to individuals in order to satisfy their needs. And he identified three, which it has to make you feel competent. It has to make you feel like you know how to do something, and when you do it, it's good for the community in general. You have to be able to feel authentic. You have to be able to feel that you can operate without guile, without presenting a facade. That if people have got to accept you in a way for what you are, because it's too stressful and energy consuming to have to keep up a sort of an image that isn't authentic over time. People want their community to make them feel authentic. And finally, of course, we are a social species. You have the society, the community has to make you feel connected to others. Many of his examples are from combat teams and other groups that operate under extreme stress, and how when a person is taken out of that environment where they've had this very close relationship, this supportive relationship, it's a traumatic experience. That is now, there's now an increasing feeling that that's a large part of what PTSD is really all about. It's one psychologist in the book describes PTSD as it's not a disease of trauma, it's a disease of recovery. Because people who have strong communities tend to recover from it rather quickly and completely. It's those who somehow feel alienated or not part of the community that they go back to that have difficulty. So those are important things that a community provides.
Could you read your cartoon?
Oh yes, the cartoon. He's saying, hey, I'm supposed to be the hunter, you're supposed to be the gatherer. And she is saying, he's standing on the stuff I want to gather. Don't stay with your gender roles. That's the only reason. So, if we wanted to be a resilient community, if we wanted to build a resilient community, first, you need to be a sustainable community. And to me, the simplest, most direct definition of a sustainable community is a community that meets today's needs without compromising the future needs, where you can go on in perpetuity. A resilient community is a sustainable community that's also capable of mitigating the effects of environmental stress. the kinds of stress we're likely to see with the effects of climate change, as an example. So, what's a resilient community? Well, if we start from the sustainable community and work forward, if you've read about sustainability before, you know, it's often described as being on a foundation of the 3 E's. You have to have an economy that's viable and can continue on without a lot of outside energy or resources being put into it. It has to be equitable. People have to feel that they are treated more or less equally. If there isn't a feeling of equitability, the community basically will eventually not survive. There has to be a feeling that both of these needs, the economy, running an economy and maintaining a social structure that's equitable, must not put an undue burden on the environment that it can't sustain over time. So it's equity, economy, and environment that make a sustainable community. When you want a resilient community, you've got to add to that the ability to return to this state even after you've had some sort of unanticipated and really unknowable disaster occur. Which means you have to do prior planning. There's all kinds of diagrams and information available about how you try to do pre-planning for a resilient community. So I include this as part of the steps you would have to take. The most important thing about this is that you may have a sustainable community, and you may have very carefully organized and supported and nurtured that community. But in some catastrophic condition or in the aftermath to it, you may have to rebuild that community in a different way, with a different set of rules, because the disaster took away some part of one of these pillars. So the idea is to come back to a sustainable community, but it may not be the sustainable community that you had before the disaster. So when we think of building resilience, we think, first of all, as the preparedness. Do we have the skills we need right here to recover from this environment? Have we got enough basic, fundamental resources to get us to the point where we can transition back to our sustainable community structure? Can we do these things? And it would also be helpful if we had some sort of system that could give us some forewarning of an upcoming disastrous event. It's interesting, VTrans now has, I get emails from them because of my involvement in Transportation Matters, like the upcoming freeze tonight, or when the rainstorm was predicted over the weekend, or windstorm was predicted a week ago. I get this email saying, you know, these counties can expect to be affected by this. You may want to deploy trucks or vehicles to various places because you may not be able to get to them because of flooding or whatever the case may be. A snowstorm would be the same thing. So on the state level, there's that kind of warning, and more attention is being paid to how you can disseminate that information if regular communications aren't available. This is the nuts and bolts stuff. This is what we think of when we think of emergency response. There are lots of agencies out there that already do this. The Red Cross. We have the Local Emergency Planning Commission here in Bennington County, who are trying to deal with these levels of problems. And they can use all the volunteers they can get if you have time. So there's some very interesting community psychology studies out there right now that talk about, well, if you're trying to build a resilient community, this is what you need. Many of them are very much related to the sustainable community items that I already talked about. Competence, do you have the skills that you need? Information and communication, environmental awareness, and feeling that you are going to, within the community, that all the risks are going to be shared and the resources are going to be shared. These are very important to building resiliency in a community. And of course, there's social capital, which can be things like public spaces that can be used in an emergency. But the real heart of human capital of social capital is the human capital. And I tend to reduce that to do the people in the community. The social capital is made up of the people and their ability to transmit or to communicate with other people around them. They have transactional skills that allow them to talk to other people, know how they're feeling, and to feel that they are being listened to. And the other part of that is trust. That in the community, social capital is based on how much the people around me trust me and how much I trust them. I didn't say this was going to be easy. So if you're going to build a resilient community, now we're getting into more my impressions of what I've read. I have less science to support this. But basically, one of the things you can do is build from the bottom up. Bottom up means networked organizations. You might consider your neighborhood being one of these gray dots, or you might consider Bennington being one of those gray dots. But the important thing is to have communication with many people who have done the same kind of thing in their neighborhood or their community, and share that information and build any organization that you decide to build outside of that node based on your connection with others, rather than trying to build it from the top down. We'll talk a little bit about the risks of the hierarchies, which we've already talked about before. Grassroots planning does these things well. You plan for your local needs. You're not planning based on what the state thinks you need. You're not planning on what the federal government thinks you need. You're planning on the basis of what you as a community know you need to recover from any disaster. You've got a much better idea of the local resources and vulnerabilities. And you're going to concentrate on where I can get those resources locally rather than where I can get them outside. I can limit my dependence on any kind of travel or communication if I plan from the bottom up. And you can better address within you, because of your knowledge of the local community, any individual or subgroup isolation. In other words, are there people you know of in this community who generally don't take part in discussions of planning or of skills, developing skills or education? I have a question I'd like to ask right now. How many of you in this room live within 4 blocks of this building? 4 blocks, okay, several, good. How many live within 2 blocks of this building?
Depends on
My
where
body,
you go.
Okay, I'm pointing out that there are parts of this community that aren't right now part of this discussion. And if you wanted to have a resilient community, we're going to have to find a way to be more inclusive and more equitable in how we treat those parts of the population, of the community. that includes being aware of unresolved conflicts or issues that may be a subtext to the community. Again, there's no innuendo here. I'm saying from what other people have found, this is something you have to watch out for if you're trying to develop a sustainable and resilient community. These are some of the other things. These are all levers to community resilience. Is the population relatively healthy? Do they have access and relatively equal access to resources within the community? And on and on. Education. What would you think about in high school, or even in elementary and middle school, involving kids in school in, well, these are some things that could happen to our community, and this is how you, as a member of that community, could help respond to it. There are other models of education that do this as part of their educational planning, where people earn the right to take on more and more responsibility within the community right up from middle school on through high school. What works against us? Well, I've said before, this hierarchical model. Hierarchical model is fine if you want to be directive from the top. One line of communication, that's all you need, but one line of communication is vulnerable if communication is cut. The network model that I showed before gives you many more possibilities of responding to any limitation in that. Again, having the hierarchy imposes a kind of a tax on everybody in the local community, just as it did with the earliest agricultural societies. There's a certain part of the resources of that community that have to be devoted to the hierarchy, whether it's in the form of taxes, whether it's in the form of food and other resources. That may or may not be a useful exchange with a hierarchy, but it does mean that something is going to come out of the community to maintain that hierarchy. Centralized resources and planning, of course, work against a community's resiliency because it makes you more dependent upon that hierarchical structure. Of course, travel and communication teams. If you're dependent on your food coming from over the mountain, that's a vulnerability. And again, these I mentioned before as things that work against us if you're trying to build a resilient community. So when I'm looking at all of this, I'm looking at, well, what I'm missing here in this whole discussion, there's lots of information about how you do it. Where are the models? Who has done this before? And I have not found many that I think are very good, but there are a couple of interesting ones. Have you ever heard of the City-Slow movement? Slow cities. These are cities, it started with one village in England. Actually, it comes from the slow foods movement. How many remember the slow foods movement? Okay. An Italian chef got so upset with McDonald's arriving in their little village in northern Italy that he started the slow foods movement, which said, what we have here is better than anything you're going to get there, and we need to protect the reasons that this food is better. Then a community in England who's about to encounter a big corporate development coming to their village says, we don't want to be part of globalization. We don't want to be part of the world. We like our village. And so these are some of the ways in which they compared themselves to the corporate or globalized world. Everything there is standardized. Everything here is customized. Everything there is corporate, top down. Everything here is grassroots. Everything there is low quality, designed for speed of production and obsolescence. Everything we do here is high quality. We do craftsmanship. We do few things that are made well. you can look through the rest of the list there. They have some very interesting material. There are now cities worldwide who are part of the Citizlow movement. There are not many, and there are particularly, interestingly enough, not many in the United States. But every place else in the world, there are people saying, enough. Okay? And this does not necessarily ensure resilience, but it does give you a sort of a model of sustainability. What we want to do is perpetuate what is good here and not make ourselves vulnerable to the same things that the rest of the world is vulnerable to. Another interesting model, this is kind of a model for resiliency. Anybody know anything about the Swiss Army?
Nice.
Everybody has to be in it, yeah, everyone's in it, and everyone's required to own a gun.
Exactly. The saying is the Swiss do not have an army, they are an army. Okay? People, every able-bodied person in Switzerland is really part of the military, and in their house they may have equipment that they need to do their job if some disaster or security event occurs. Might be communication equipment. In many cases, it's an automatic weapon locked in a closet with ammunition. And given loss of all communication but some disaster, they already know where they are to go and what they are to do. It is the ultimate networking of an army. Now that's an interesting model to think about in a community where, as our previous governor said, everybody's got a backhoe, okay? And when the river floods, people are out there working at it already. Wouldn't it be nice if they knew what to be doing with the backhoe in advance of the disaster? And this is another interesting model. During disasters, people tend to organize themselves in the ways that I'm talking about here as a natural occurrence. Administrators don't necessarily do it, but on a person-to-person level, whether it's Katrina or it's Harvey or it's Maria, people tend to do what needs to be done, and on a very equitable level. This phrase comes from a graffiti item that was scrawled on a wall in Sarajevo a few years ago, 20 years after the Bosnian War. The Bosnian War was horrible for civilians. There were snipers on every rooftop. You could not go out. But people found ways, working through the rubble and the tunnels, to get what they needed on a pretty widespread basis. What this graffiti is lamenting is that after the disaster was over, people went back to being like they were before the disaster. So the question I end up with is, if you wanted to create a resilient community, how do you do it before the disaster? So that's where I'm going to end. First of all, do you have any questions about any of the information I presented? I've got a reference list here as well if you want information about any of the readings or directed material. But questions about anything that I've said that seems that you want to challenge or that think is you didn't understand? Yes?
This is a model for how you deal with like a physical disaster.
Yes.
Flood.
But, Irene, I would say it would be a good model of that.
Yes,
Okay.
okay. But it seemed to me that your description of resilience and what is a problem for resilience relates to other kinds of things, changes as well. You know, you could say that the computer was a disaster culturally, because, or had to be responded to as sort of a slow disaster because it required changes in how it affected everything. And there are still people who consider that, well, and we all do to some extent, that the way to have a resilient, sustainable, satisfying community is to have something that doesn't change. That you choose a point, and that's the ideal society, and stays that way.
Yeah.
And how to build, I think that if one learned how to do that cycle of planning and analysis and response and reevaluation in many different realms, that it would spill over and become, create a much better society without it being either static or having the folks who are involved in, say, Silicon Valley running off with the culture and a lot of other people being left entirely behind.
I think what you pointed to, as I understand it, is that the only difference between the kind of upheaval we're seeing in some of the first things that I mentioned in the first slide is time frame. Yeah. A disaster is something that happens with very little notice and over a short period of time. But as you say, there are disasters that are slow moving and gradual and hard to recognize. And certainly I think climate change is in that category.
Right, I think that's the lobster in the pot where you situation. So you need some portion of this group that has vision or spends their time envisioning what may be coming at you on the scale of decades. And but you need it at the local level. And I don't know how you generate that, but you don't specifically have them in your structure, although I assume that they're sort of implicitly there.
You're right, and one thing I have in my notes, but that never appears on the screen, as you say, is some kind of visioning process for, we're going to have to redesign the way we think about our community because it's something that's happened. What's the process by which you do that is equitable and inclusive enough that it doesn't create more division?
But I'm specifically thinking that it's not a reactive mechanism, it's more like thinking ahead. And we don't do that very well as human beings, and certainly not in this culture.
Yeah, it's the one thing we don't have time for.
Yeah.
Two things. One, I think we need to distinguish very carefully between a community that's resilient to disaster, distinct events like Irene, and what we need to do in terms of climate change, because that is, as has been pointed out, a creeping disaster, a slow disaster, and thinking about what we have to respond to under those circumstances is really difficult. The other thing is, it strikes me that Bennington is still dealing with a disaster, and when you were talking about conflicts in the society or inequities in the community, Bennington suffered from the loss of the mills and the manufacturing sector. And so it's really evident that there's a large portion of the community who hasn't recovered from that.
Yes.
And so one way to think about a resilient community is to think about how do we repair that? How do we move that into a more equitable, sustainable community for everyone? And maybe if we did that, then we could think about the future.
I agree with you, and I think well, this is a town that may have a history that also is being bifurcated to some extent by an old model of, other people have said it, the labor's managers and owners in the past. Do we still see ourselves that way? I can't really judge that, but certainly there are aspects of the community that don't seem equitable, at least in the sense of representation in this kind of discussion. And solving those old problems is just as critical as solving the new ones. Okay. Yeah.
Well, in Hoosier Falls, as an organization that's trying to build community, they don't say resilient, but maybe the assumption is that communities are, by their nature, resilient once you build them. And there's a long list of suggestions on different ways that you can build community in the town. It's listed at Thorpe's Pharmacy there. And things like, go out for a walk and keep your eyes off the sidewalk and, say hello to people. And item number 47 on the list is turn up your music. And item number 48 on the list is turn down your music.
I think one of the items on the list ought to be make some music. And so, but that's, as Scott said, there are a lot of uses that we can make of our days that might be better than what we do.
One of the things that I'm just going to pop in here is that all of you came to this talk tonight because I'll call you first responders. You're thinking, you've put yourself out there to spend 2 hours down here listening to not such great news. And so what I would say is that we're looking at a sovereign group of people that are able to stand, and by your basic actions in your everyday life, we can begin to move towards this community and this resilience that we're hoping to find. And I'm betting that each one of you are completely active in our community in varieties of ways. So my intent with this meeting tonight, and why I've been talking with Bruce and Scott and Larry for these past years, is to spread that by our own actions, but also have a realistic point of view of how things are happening quicker than most everybody says they are. So with that in mind, we can live our lives well.
And again, I'm just putting these up as a thought piece. I'm not directing, politicking, recruiting, enlisting, whatever. There is one experiment I would like to try tonight. What I would like to do is have everybody in the room tell me what your response to the presentation you've heard tonight is. You don't have to, of course, if you don't want to speak, don't speak. But I'd like to have like one sentence, one phrase, or one word about how you respond to what you saw both in Scott's presentation and my presentation tonight. If I could put Mary Ellen on the spot, I'd make her first.
Hopeful.
Okay.
If I were to add to that, because of this notion of people who want to face the fact that there are challenges, whether or not they're problems or not, but we will always face challenges. And this notion of having some desire and then even some skills for being able to address those challenges on an ongoing basis, it makes me hopeful.
Sure.
I'm encouraged.
That's good.
This is more than what I hoped for.
Well, one way that we've tried to reduce our carbon footprint in our house is switching to a plant-based diet. Not everybody, but some of us. And from what I've seen and what I've read, if more people did it, it would make a huge difference.
There's a lot more people here than I expected, and that's a hopeful thing. And I agree with you, Jim. I read something that said if people just replaced beef with beans in their diet, that we would meet the, was it the Paris Accords or something? Just by making that one change, changing up things.
Oh,
Mhm.
yeah, I like the emphasis on resilience and how we respond to disasters, but this takes a whole different way of thinking because it's a long, slow sort of thing, but maybe quicker than we think, obviously, faster than, and there's so much uncertainty, and that's what you have to be able to live with that.
Swiss Army was kind of interesting because somebody has got to set this stuff up.
Yes.
And I imagine it came from the top.
Actually, it's my understanding that it's done on a pretty low level. In other words, certainly, there's a general in the Swiss Army, but that the communities themselves
Well, like I said, somebody's got to set it up.
identify what needs to be done.
This is what we need, and
Yeah.
who can fill it?
Right.
That's where you got to start.
Those banks.
I read somewhere about this Swiss thing that because of the geography of the country, they cannot rely upon one solid army, so each community has to have their own protection, kind of.
Does it include the women?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, does, okay.
Okay, well, this whole, what do you call it, program, it feels like voting.
Feels like.
Voting.
Voting.
When you go over the impact of individuals, it feels like voting. I mean, on one hand, the individual feels powerless. On the other hand, it's all cumulative among individuals.
Yeah.
So it's, when you're going to vote, it's like, well, how much of an impact does your vote make? Does that make sense? I don't know.
Yes, it does.
Okay.
Yeah.
We just found out what 6 people did.
Well, I found out we have a lot of work to do as a community and as human beings.
Well, your last sentence that was up there on the presentation that you did right through was about planning, being a resilient community would plan for disasters that might happen. And it hit me too. An NPR broadcast today that one of the cities over in the New York area, Albany area, had a lockdown system worked out in their public library. They announced that at like 1:30, everybody in the building would be involved in this and was expected to participate. And they said they're just the series of mass killings. They said those things can happen anywhere. What would you do? And what were the things that you should be thinking? If you're near an exit, get out. And when you get out, get to a safe place behind other buildings, etc. If you can't get out, if you can get yourself into a hiding place, preferably locked into some building, and then if you're in that type of situation and whatever the shooter is breaks in, fight. And any type of fighting is illegal in that type of situation. And I was just thinking, that looks like a piece of resilient community being built. For a horrible thing, but disasters are usually horrible.
I like the depth and the overview because I realized how little I really did know that I didn't know. And coming from scarcity has always been important to me because living on Whipstock Hill, the first thing I thought about, where's water? And where is when electricity goes out? What do I do? So having a little stove, or how to make fire, or a candle, or running down where the water actually pours down the hillside. But that's of course selfish, but it is on my mind, and always has.
Yeah.
So it was wonderful.
It triggered in me both of these things, the importance of educating people into individual responsibilities for the group, which includes, if you don't vote, you're going to be fined.
Stuart?
Well, just on the presentation, I appreciate the fact it was, I guess it's something you should appreciate, that it was factual and rational, even though the statement you made, most decisions are emotional, I do agree with, but without having some factual basis, then I think you're adrift.
Yes, and we still are reliant on the kind of science that Scott presented in his presentation, and we shouldn't abandon that. Even though we, in our day-to-day operations, we may have this problem with rationality, it's still a discipline that we can maintain and carry forward. I agree. Jean?
Well, I always enjoy hearing people think about community, what it means, how you develop it, where it's going. So for me, that was great.
I want to say my grandchildren are on my mind.
Oh, well, I saw it as learning both about science and technology and also about communities. And you have to figure out a way to merge those together.
It was enlightening. A lot of stuff I didn't know, and while I could not possibly say what I repeat it to anyone tonight, it's good to know something about how complex the situation is. And I think that the difficulties of, you brought up the Act 47 vote. It is a test case. It is a example of how things don't work. About elites, about things coming down from below, about down from the top, about people, about communication and involving people, and people thinking anything's important or that they have any say, or even most people didn't know that there was a vote.
Sorry?
I came late, but I knew most of what you were talking about already.
Okay.
I live in an intentional community, which happened by accident, but works very well. I am seriously concerned for my grandchildren. I try to make decisions that will make it easy for them to survive where they are for the next 65 years, so that maybe when we get through this, there will be some culture left. The number of people who will be displaced, who are being displaced, the number of cultures and languages and traditions that are being destroyed is so unfathomable that I despair. I think maybe I should keep books, because at least you could open the books, and I will be like the monasteries where they discover Vitruvius 1,500 years later. I do not have a lot of hope.
I'm still back on the resilience and the planning, thinking, foreseeing aspect of this, because the examples of resilience that are given are resilience that is produced by training. And training has definite goals, objectives, and methods, and allows you to pre-position supplies, materials, and people. But the kind of crises we face don't lend themselves to that at the moment. And that's,
Exactly.
you just said it.
Yes.
You know, that we are, I think, I don't have much hope for us as a race, because I think we're tipping over the abyss. And that's the, it may be that it's...
Why do I keep the books? Maybe somebody will read them someday.
Yeah, it's Fahrenheit 451 without the burning, maybe, or maybe with the burning. You keep culture alive as best you can.
These kinds of discussions always make me feel apart. I am not an optimist. I'm pessimist. Being in a room with people makes me extremely uncomfortable, so the whole concept of community is hard for me to embrace. This was all fascinating. The first part had to do with the long view. The second part had to do with the short view, intentionally so, obviously. The question is how to get those things together. If we were the white-footed mouse, as you said, we'd be a whole lot better off. But always, we're all responding personally, yes? My personal response is to go home and live under my rock again. And knit, for when we have no heat.
So I think I live with Jerry, so, so I get a picture of this, I have it. So this gives me a lot of really good information from both presentations, and it puts it in perspective. So so urgency, I think that's important, urgency. And not to take this for granted, and to realize the importance of what we're hearing. Also to appreciate future generations. We have grandchildren now, and so there's sadness. I mean, this is shocking, isn't it? And so it's not to be taken, I'm not going to crawl under my little whatever, I hope, if I do, maybe I'm a little wiser when I want to blank out, right? And so why are we alive anyway, So looking at our point in history, if this is history, if this is what's happening for this time period, then we should take it seriously, right? So how exciting to talk about how we should have resilience in our community. Reminds me of our son Forrest, That's all he does. How can we have people come and live on the land, It's, whatever, how can we take care of community? Build from the bottom up. So I totally appreciated this presentation.
I find it comforting to be in a room with like-minded people, because I think about this stuff a lot to the point of obsession, and I didn't really think other people took it that seriously. Comforting.
An awful lot of people are gonna get awfully hungry.
Yes. Maybe not in the next 10 years, but sometime.
Well, I found the scientific information fascinating. I knew some of it, but certainly not a majority of it. But I just can't, in my mind, put together the two pictures, his picture and your picture. And I believe in your picture, but I, see the bigger picture, and it really scares me. And I know that we, as people, tend to be reactive and not proactive. And the situation is so dire, it just keeps my head spinning.
I think two things are very important, and that is we have to have three things. We have to have little periods of time to escape, because this is such an overwhelming concept. But then two, we need to turn back to and ask questions of each other and get the dialogue going. And then the other thing is, I think we need to talk to our grandchildren, our children and our grandchildren, and get the dialogue going with them rather than protect them from hearing our own fear.
Jared, you want?
There's there is a workshop next Thursday here, and it's called CABB, and it's concerned with actually building that resilience here in our community. And it's going to be led by Lisa Carton and Judith Schwartz, and it will be a participatory exercise that should help us understand a little bit more about ourselves and our community.
And steps forward.
And this is serendipity. We did not plan this as a sequence of lectures, but it's turned out that way, and it gives you some idea how much attention is being paid to these apparently intractable problems that we're dealing with. And that, I think, in itself is a hopeful sign.
And that's next Thursday, right?
That's next Thursday, same time, same place, and they will also be doing the same presentation on Saturday at the Left Bank in North Bennington. No, a week from. Yeah.
As it warms up, it thaws out. Some of it will get absorbed into the waters, and some of it will get to the atmosphere. In the last couple of years, we've been seeing the methane in the atmosphere of the Arctic is doubling on an annual basis. It's still a very low number, but doubling, as you know, doesn't really take too long to become a significant factor. It's not known how much exactly is going to eventually bubble out, how the temperatures, there's a lot of unknowns, but there's a lot of concern here. Something that we don't need to go there. That's hypothetical. We can stick to the real stuff. All right, we got to do it again. So in the Arctic, the ice did en masse until there was too much greenhouse gas. The burning of coal and oil took a toll, but the tankers can now easily pass. They are passing, by the way. You may have even heard the last few years there have been some people pushing things more and more. It was recently from the Russian port, which is right about here. They, for commercial purposes, they sailed pretty much all the way along here and through the Bering down to South Korea, delivering some, I believe it was oil drilling equipment. There have been some for pay tourist type things that have been going through the Northwest Passage. This is called the Northwest Passage, if you're wondering. You always hear this. It tends to go through, not the north side, but further downward, it tends to be warmer. As you recall, with this being cold, the ice tends to pile up and through here and flow on this side. This side tends to stay a little bit cleaner. This side is the Northeast Passage. I don't know why it's all based on the Atlantic Ocean for the Northeast and Northwest, but that's how they define it. What will probably happen is instead of having to skirt around, they're probably going to have the ability to start going north of some of these islands at some point. They might not because they like to stay close to land and ports, but the options there might make it more attractive to go drilling in these areas that become less likely to have ice throughout the year. Next thing. Temperate zone weather will tend to stagnate. We're going to get into a different kind of physics here. This is going to be about kind of mechanics and fluid motion a little bit. You might recall some of this again from high school, but this is going to do some conceptual stuff here. This is not to scale, in case you didn't know that. And that's not really what the sun looks like. And we're going to go with the equinox, where the sun is directly above the equator. It's not that. The Earth isn't tipped towards or away from the sun at this point. And what happens with this is this spot on the Earth gets more energy than down here. Pretty much the equator is the bullseye. And what happens with that is The air, oh, I should have mentioned this thin blue haze you see here, that's supposed to represent the troposphere. Again, not to scale. Here at the equator, it's probably 12, 15 miles deep, and at the poles, it's probably only like 5 miles deep. It kind of slows out. There's a few reasons for that. Warmth is one. The other one is you might know, the Earth bulges a little bit at the equator. Well, the atmosphere even bulges a little bit at the equator too. So what happens is the warm air here, as you know, likes to rise. And it will rise up the 10, 12, 13 miles to the top of the troposphere. And then it will spill out going south and north. It does this on the other side too, but I'm only showing it here because the sun's on this side. And it wants to go south. Similar thing is, where is it the coldest? At the poles. And what happens at the poles? The air likes to fall down. And that creates high pressure because the cold air is doing so. And it wants to flow closer to the ground towards the equator. There's a problem though in that the speed that this will have to go and this would have to go to meet each other, they can't do it. The air becomes too turbulent and it breaks down, and instead it does these shorter cells. These are called the Hadley cells nearest the equator, and then the polar cells at the other end. These are all thermally driven cells, and they exist all the time. This is a band. If we could look at this, it's like a big torus that wraps all the way around the Earth in a kind of a big circle, and the whole time it's spinning. The one here in the southern hemisphere this way, and one in the northern hemisphere that way. Same thing up here. These are spinning the same way. The tops are going towards the pole, and then the more northerly stuff at the ground is coming to the south. We end up with these stagnant areas here, you would think, but that's not quite how it works. This air is falling down, and this air at approximately 60 degrees north is going up. That causes an indirect looping to take place in here. Now we've added the Faro cells. The Faro cells balance this all out. The Hadley and polar cells are driven by temperature differences between these two locations. And here, for the polar cell, while it's not particularly warm at 60 degrees north, it's a lot warmer than it is at the pole typically. Same thing here, while it's pretty warm at 30 degrees, which is like Pensacola, Florida, it's still noticeably cooler than it is at the equator. Should mention, we talked about this being the equinox. This changes throughout the year a little bit as the Earth tips one way or the other. These cells will sort of slide to the north and sort of to the south, but they're usually fairly close to where they're located here. We look at the other side of the planet, same sort of thing. I'm going to think this is where I'm going to point out a little bit. Yeah. What happens when the air comes up here at the equator? Anyone know what happens when you have air that goes up into less dense areas? The pressure's less. It cools down. It's an adiabatic. Remember that from physics? It cools down naturally. You can't do anything about it. Cooler air can't contain as much moisture. It tends to rain here near the equator. Think of Indonesia, the Congo, back on our side of the planet, that's the Amazon. Areas that tend to see regular rain. On the converse side of it is where you have this cool air at the top of the atmosphere and it comes down. Same principle, but as it's coming down, becoming more dense, it warms up. It has no moisture in it anymore. So as it comes down and descends and creates a high pressure zone around 30 degrees north and south, you have the Australian deserts, you have the Kalahari. On the other side of in our hemisphere, you have the Patagonian Atacamas in the South America straddling that line. In the northern hemisphere, you have the Gobi just a little bit north, the Tar, the Arabian, the Sahara deserts, and then in the North America, you have the Chihuahua in Mexico, the Mojave in the desert southwest of the United States. They're all very close to these locations. There are two other prime, huge deserts, although we tend to not think of the one so much, and that's at the poles. They have the same thing going on. They have this high pressure with dry air hitting them. All that ice and snow, we tend to not think of them as being deserts, but they are barren. They get actually very little precipitation. Same thing happens at the North Pole, but without it being land, we tend not to think of it that way. If we spread it all out, here again, we can see it. It's kind of faint, but there's 30 degrees south. You have the deserts, and then 30 degrees north, deserts all the way across through here. Kind of an anomaly here in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, India, so on, Cambodia. What's happening here is we have some huge glaciers in the Himalayas, and then we also have, get to it, but the trade winds are coming from the east, and they tend to sweep moist air from the oceans across at the same time. The confluence of these things means that this particular area happens to be a little moister than you would expect near 30 degrees. But the Thar Desert is just over there a little bit from where that is. Next part of this, so we got all those flows going, all those cells. Remember the directions they're kind of going here and all? The other thing that happens with the Earth is because the Earth is spinning, you know, here we are in New England, we're going to see the sun that was over here first, and then California's going to follow. The Earth is turning around this way. If you're at the equator, it's about 1,000 miles an hour. You're spinning around on the Earth's axis. If, wrong way again. Too far. No, that's good. If you go up to 60 degrees north, which is up here in Hudson Bay, in a day, you're going about 500 miles an hour to stay on the Earth in that one spot. So what's happening here, we have a balloon at the top of the troposphere at the equator, up at 12, 14 miles, whatever it is, and we launch it into that troposphere and it wants to go north. All that air at the equator is going a little over 1,000 miles an hour. As it goes up from a little bit west of the Galapagos towards, I don't know, New Mexico, it can't actually go this way. It's going faster than the ground. So not only does it go north, it will be going to the east. Not expected perhaps, but that's what's happening. Same thing, the air at the surface of the ground that's in Pensacola again, and if we were to launch it in a balloon that's in the lower atmosphere, you would think it would tend to come down here to South America. It actually will drift backwards. So any winds that are aloft that are going north, they tend to go forward on the Earth. And same thing with the air that's lower to the surface, it tends to drift back to the west. Another video, this is a little hard to see. If you've ever been on a merry-go-round or a circular toy, and you try to do things like walk, it can be really hard because you think you can walk this way, but you're going to fall. So this is two nerds at MIT. I can call them that because I'm a nerd. Simple. Now they get spinning. When he let go of the ball, watch when they let go of the ball goes straight. Problem is, the guy he's throwing it to is no longer there.
You should have the sound on, because they're probably...
I'm not going to stick with this much longer. Yeah, anyway, that's hopefully you can understand that the Earth is moving out from underneath, so they're either going too fast or too slow. Compendium of everything put together. So we have all these spirals up in the upper atmosphere. These are very stable, these four, I should say, the two Hadleys and then the two polar cells. The ferro cells are indirectly driven by essentially rubbing against these adjacent cells. If either of these cells start to weaken, this, which isn't a very strong cell, will also weaken. The motion of all these as they're flying around up here causes the surface winds between 0 and 30 degrees north to come out of the northeast, easterly direction, and from 30 to 60 we have prevailing west winds. Now these are actually called trade winds here. These are very reliable, extremely steady. And up here at the pole and down at the other pole, we also have, because of the direction of this flow up here, the direction it's going, at the ground the air wants to come out of the east. Those are the polar easterlies on both ends, and these are the trade winds. These tend to be called the northeast and these are the southeast, but essentially they mean east on these. If you look at this, you'll also have a sense of American history a little bit. Remember how they were running slaves and rum and goods from the old world to the new world? If you think about it, it's particularly easy to come into this area from across the Atlantic. And from up where we are, it's pretty easy to go back. That helps set up some of your trade routes. If you tried to sail from here back to England, best thing to do would probably be go up the coast first and then try and cross over. If you try to go this way, you're fighting the winds the whole way. So, what do we have on this? This is all from the Ferrel cells and the Coriolis effect. These winds that we rely on to move our weather are dependent on this, which is dependent on these two cells that are adjacent to us. These cells are dependent on temperature differences in these locations to keep them moving. The North Pole is warming wrong way. We don't need to see them again. So what happens here is those westerlies that we've kind of been used to, they tend to meander. They're not particularly strong. As there's high pressure and low pressure systems, they can kind of have a huge influence on this as it's going across. But these westerlies will push the weather from west to east, and we get a regular changing thing. It used to be 30, 40 years ago, you might remember this, you'd wash your car on the weekend, and it would rain on Monday, and you'd wash it the following weekend, and it would rain again on that next Monday. It was kind of a regular sequence, or every weekend it would rain again and screw up your plans. And that's because the way the weather systems moved across was fairly reliable. It was about 7 days from one low and a high and another low to come through. What's happening now, as the westerlies become weaker, these storms tend to meander a lot more, and there's a lot more up and down motion instead of west to east. Let's see if we can get this here. Okay. The colors here are denoting the wind speeds in the up and down motion. This is from 1980 in the summertime, and then a month or two earlier, a few years back. And what's happening is the purples and blues are indicating winds that are heading to the north, and the deep reds and oranges are indicating winds that are to the south. And the speeds here, 20 meters, so this is about, say, 44, 45 miles an hour. These winds are headed south, and these winds here are probably more like 50 miles an hour headed to the north. There's a lot of up and down motion you can see here, and there's actually quite a few of those all the way around. And this is in our temperate zone between 30 and 60 degrees north. If we go back to 1980, you can see a couple spots here where there's a little bit of red, or a fair amount of red going on, but there aren't a lot, and we don't see any spot where there's a lot of wind going north. This varies from day to day, but this is indicative of what's happened over the last 35, 40 years with the winds. Another simple shot. When things are moving along smartly, the cold air and warm air, they separate each other. This is another factor. As you get more undulations happening, you start mixing. You bring more warm air up and you get more cold air down. This happens all the time. It's going to happen with more frequency, more regularity, and more intensity than it has happened in the past. These polar vortexes the last few years, had a couple of them or whatever. Who knows, but that's the sort of thing you can anticipate seeing more of. We're also, over the last few years, many times, where in December and January, at the North Pole, it was above freezing. That's kind of unheard of, and it happened 2 or 3 times in the last few years. Here are the undulations. This is from May 7th of this year. I try to grow a garden, and it's hard to see, but Florida's right here, Texas, New England's up here, North Pole. We got stuck for a while. We had a period of, I think it was about 10, 12 days where it rained all of those days, some days a lot, some days just a little bit, but there was very little sun, no chance for things to dry out. Who can attribute to anything? This is incredibly complicated, but these are the sorts of things that we're going to see more of. Ideally, this would look kind of like a belt in your engine. It kind of goes around things. It's a little lumpy here and there. Occasionally, it might make one little flow. But you can see this is just kind of like a crazy engine that has gears and cogs everywhere, and some of them aren't even connected, and things are split off. Other thing that was seen this past year that's never been seen in the world is one of these flows in the temperate zone. It was back in June. It actually crossed the equator. Bizarre. Who knows? But these are the sorts of things that probably will be much more normal going forward. So our weather is moved by the westerlies until the north warms to many degrees. Instead of around, winds will go up and down, and then we will have hell or a deep freeze. It's not just temperatures though, like I said, it's moisture. You can get into a spot, if you're on the wrong side of this, and a high pressure gets locked onto you, you can stay dry for weeks. That's just as bad if you're trying to do all sorts of things. We've talked about washing cars or going to the beach for the weekend. But there are things that are much more important and significant that will happen because of this. Global food production will be stressed. I talked about my simple garden, trying to get some stuff in. I have a greenhouse, I could do that. Well, you can't plant thousands of acres of crops in greenhouses all over the planet. It's just not a doable thing. So we go back to this again. You see we have deserts at the 30s. Here's our sweet spot here. This is where we like to think of the world existing. There's another fairly sweet spot down here. There isn't a lot of land mass compared to the northern hemisphere. But this is where the crops are grown. And I think you have, it's just shy of 2/3 of the world's crops are grown in our northern temperate zone. Fair chunk, remember the glaciers and the way the land is, the winds are, they actually get some moisture in this area. And we know there's a ton of people here that need food, so they're probably pushing the environment a little more than they would otherwise. There's too many people everywhere pushing the environment more than they should. We shouldn't forget about that. What do we have? What's the next chart? So 2/3 of the crops. This is kind of a strange look. If you ever want to see some cool maps, this guy's got some. This is showing how many people live how far north and south. It's not where on the earth they live, it's just how many live at 60 degrees north. Well, not very many, probably up here in Scandinavian countries or something like that. It really picks up in the temperate zone. Just under half of the people, this is a couple years old, but it's probably pretty close to the same. It's about 47% of the people lived in our temperate zone. Another very significant portion, it's about 42% lived below that. A lot of that's going to be from India, of course. That's hundreds of millions of people probably are just over the line in India there. And then Central America has its share. We get down here, we're down to 8%, just a couple percent here, and less than 1% up in this northern area. The interesting thing here is while a little less than half the people live here, about 2/3 of the crops are grown here. That sounds good in that we have extra. I mean, we're helping to feed people in other places that don't have the same proportion. Problem with that is, as our environment gets stressed, not only are we going to maybe struggle to feed ourselves, but there's a whole bunch of other people that are going to be wondering what they're doing too. I'm going to wrap this up. There's a lot of stuff I'm throwing at you. Limericks are coming fast because this is nothing. I got nothing good except limericks here. I'm sorry, and they're not even good, right? Limericks are never that good. So the North Pole will certainly warm, and world hunger may be the norm. Because without winter ice, the corn, wheat, and rice will be parched or drowned in a storm. I have one other that I'm going to end this with, and while this might seem negative, I want you to maybe not see it that way, and I'm going to hopefully lead into proofs a little bit here. We all think of carpe diem, let's go carpe gaudium, seize the joy. So we're headed for terrible times with ice melting in northern climes. It all seems so sad, but it's not all so bad. These lines are still 5 in their rhymes. Barely, I know, but it's there. When you got all this bad stuff coming at you, it can be a little overwhelming. And when we did this in July, about this point, there were some people who looked really glum. I think I changed it around a little bit. It's not quite as depressing, or maybe you're dozing off, I don't know what here, but we kind of came up with a few things in that in several decades, most of us aren't going to be here anymore anyway, right? And how we approach things regarding all this doesn't change anything. The world is the exact same as it was when you came in here this evening. And it'll be virtually the same next week, next month, next year. There's changes happening, but how you approach things, that's really up to you. And there's really no reason, because you maybe have a better sense of what might be happening in the world, to be all down and depressed. Life goes on. We still have our families and our friends, garden plot maybe. You make music, paint. You can do the Congo line on the beach like these folks if you want to. Don't despair with this stuff. Don't be afraid of it. Think of Tom Andrews and Tilly Smith at the front end of this thing. They weren't really being brave. They were just being honest. That's really all they were doing. And because of their efforts, they were able to save the lives of many people that were really close to them at that time. They were able to have a huge impact. I'm not sure we're talking life and death issues at this point in our lives for us in this room, but we're probably talking quality of life for most everyone in this room. And a lot of the quality comes from your approach. It's not so much if you have the current device or you have to turn the lights off or stop reading when it gets dark at night, or whatever the case might be, whatever kind of hardship, those might make us stronger. I think you're going to touch on that a little bit too, that some of the hardships are a wonderful way to bring people together. So that's all I have for you. Thanks, I'm sorry.